Hi, I'm Brad Hunt from Smooth Fusion, and in this video I'm going to demonstrate how to use Google Data Studio to visualize data from Sitefinity Insight. As far as the agenda for our presentation, first we'll look at what is Google Data Studio, then we'll look at how to connect Google Data Studio to Sitefinity Insight. We'll understand the data that's available that comes from Sitefinity Insight. We'll then deconstruct a sample report that's been provided to us by Progress. And then finally, we'll look at building your own custom dashboards using Sitefinity Insight data. As far as the audience for the presentation, I'll assume that you have some familiarity with Sitefinity Insight and how it's used in combination with Sitefinity to create and track personas and lead scores and so on. But I don't assume that you know anything about Google Data Studio. So let's get started. So the first thing to understand is, what is Google Data Studio? Here's an example report in Google Data Studio, and as you can see, it provides an interactive way to interact with data, and it provides charts and tables and various graphs, different kinds. You can do things like mouse over and see data points. You can do things like sort and filter chart data. You can also interact with data by using drill down charts and clicking on different data points that are connected to each other in the chart. And also do things like filter the chart based on certain date ranges. And so this is a very standard kind of data visualization tool. It may be similar to things like Power BI or Tableau if you've used those tools in the past. And so the way that these reports work is that they connect to one or more data sources through a connector. And the folks over at Progress have created a data connector that's specific for Google Data Studio to interact with Sitefinity Insight. And you can find more about the connector in the Progress Sitefinity Insight documentation under the marketing section at the very bottom, or you can just search the documentation for Google Data Studio connector. And what's shown in this documentation is roughly what I'm going to be showing you today in the video. But if you'd like the steps in a written form, you can find them here in the documentation. So when using Google Data Studio, the first thing that you want to do is you want to add a data source. And when I click on Add Data Source, we're going to see a number of available connectors. And at the very top of the list, I can see all the ones that are provided by Google. Or I can search the list of connectors for Progress, and I can find Progress Sitefinity Insight connector. So I'll go ahead and select that connector. And the first thing that I have to do is authorize the account that I'm logged into Google with to use this connector. And I'll do that quickly just by logging in with my personal account and clicking Allow. And once I've authorized this connector, the next thing I need to do is actually tell the connector which data center in Sitefinity Insight to connect to. And that's done by using an API key. So I've already got Progress Sitefinity Insight open. I've got a number of different data centers, and I've got one for Smooth Fusion, which is the one that we're going to connect to. And I'll go over to Access Keys, and I see a list of access keys that I've already generated for other applications and demos. But I'll create a new access key, and I'll just call this one Data Studio. I don't want this access key to have access to every data center, so I'm just going to select the Smooth Fusion Data Center and click Generate. And this will give me this large key that I want to copy here. And once that's copied, I go back over to Google Data Studio and paste in the key and hit Submit. And so now what that'll do is authorize against that data center. And I have the option now to check the ones that that key has access to. So I can select it from the drop-down. And the other thing to note is there's an option here that says Use Report Template for New Reports, and it's provided by the connector's creator. So we'll go ahead and check that so that we can see a sample report that's provided by Progress. And then I'll click Connect. Now that I've done that, Google Data Studio has made a connection to Sitefinity Insight. And it's showing me the available fields that have been provided from Sitefinity Insight. And so these fields come over with names already provided by Progress. And you also get a description. And the same information can be found over in the documentation. So if I go back to Progress Sitefinity Insight documentation and scroll down a little bit from where I was, you can see a description of all the fields that are available and the name and a description of what they are. So the same information can be found here as well. And we'll talk more about this in a minute. But these are all the fields that have come in from Sitefinity Insight along with the data types for each field. And so now that we've connected the data, let's create a report. And to start with, we're going to allow this data source to create a new sample report, and we can just start to get a sense for some of the data that we can visualize from Sitefinity Insight. So again, this is a sample report that's been provided by Progress, and this is actually connected to my data source. And so it's actually pulling in data from my instance of Sitefinity Insight. But before we drill into this, let's take a step back and try to understand what data is available from Sitefinity Insight and how to use that data. And then we'll come back and try to deconstruct how this report was put together. So I'm going to come back to my list of items and look at my recent reports. And you'll see some things that I've already created in the past. I've created something I called a cheat sheet, so we're going to start with that. And right now this report only has some text down the left-hand side of the screen. There's nothing interactive and no data, and it's currently in view mode. So I'm going to put it in edit mode by clicking the edit button in the upper right-hand corner. And then you'll see I get some additional toolbars across the top. And the first thing I want to do to be able to use this report or to create a report is to add some data to the report. And when I click Add Data, there will be a section pop up and I can view the data sources that I've already connected to. And here is the Progress Sitefinity Insight data source that we just connected. So I'll click on Add, and I'll allow this to be added to the report. And so now, behind the scenes, that data is available on this report. And so to start visualizing data, we need to add a chart to the report because right now there's nothing interactive. So just generally speaking, Google Data Studio refers to all these different items as charts, and there's all these different kinds of charts that you can add. But we'll start with something simple, which is just a table. And I'll be able to drag and drop this table on this design surface. And when I do, you'll notice that it automatically tried to pick up some things from our data source. So now that this table is selected, I get some new menu options over at the right-hand side of the screen. So at the top, it tells me the data source is the Progress Sitefinity Insight data source. And if I go down a little bit further, you'll see there's a dimension, and then there's a metric. And these terms are also used in Google Analytics, so you may be familiar with those. But a dimension is typically a text value or a name value, and you can see here the type is conversion, persona, touch point, and lead scoring, whereas the value is listed under the metric. So the value or the metric is typically some sort of numeric value. In this case, it's the measure of the number of personas or the number of touch points that have been hit, things like that. If we go further down the page, you can see different kinds of configuration options. You can see we can set rows per page. I can add a summary row to the table. And as you check off these options, the table's interactive and will start to change. You can set the default sorting. You can also do things like date range. By default, this is set to the last 28 days of data. You can also add filters, which we'll talk about in a moment. And then there's also a Style tab at the top. So if I click on Style, I can get some specific formatting around the headers and labels and body, none of which is important for me to change right now. So just primarily interested with the data at this point. So again, when I dropped this table onto the design surface, it automatically picked up some data from the data source. And so let's take a look at what are the options, what are the data points that come from Sitefinity Insight. These data points are defined back over in the documentation. Further down from where we were a minute ago, there's a section on the fields that are available, and it tells us that the type, for example, has lead score, persona, conversion, and touch points. Those are the things that are surfaced under that type field. Just to sort of make it where I don't have to go back and forth between the documentation, that's why I created this cheat sheet. And so down the left-hand side, you can start to see. So in this table, the first dimension is type. And again, the supported types that are exposed from Sitefinity Insight are conversion, touchpoint, persona, and lead scoring. And I have all of those defined in Insight, so they all show up there. The next item that I could add to my table is a child. And you can see the child is only relevant for lead scoring only. So let's see what that does if I add a dimension and I choose child. You'll see that for many of the things in the table, like the conversion and the persona and the touch point, the child is null because there's not really a concept of a child object under a touch point or a child under a persona. But when you think about a lead score is divided into stages. And so in my case, I have a lead score that has a cold, a hot, and then a marketing qualified lead as children. And so that's why the child is only appropriate for lead scoring. The next thing we could add is a name, and it's the name of whatever the thing is as it's defined in Insight. So the name of the conversion or the name of the persona. So let's see what happens when I add the name. The chart will add additional rows so that we can see all the various names. And if I expand this over, you can start to see, well, one of the conversions is a contact form. And one of the personas is a corporate marketer whose interest is Sitefinity, and so on. So you can see the actual names as we've defined those items inside of Sitefinity Insight. Each item also will have a date. And so if we add a date to the chart, we're going to start to even get more data because now we're going to see additional rows that represent each of the individual items from Insight. And typically what we're looking for is aggregate data or sums of data so that the date may not be as appropriate. Now we've gone up to 308 rows. So let's take date out of our table. That's not something we need at the moment. But let's look at this last value, which is the unit. So I'm going to add another dimension, which is unit. And this is a great way to kind of explore and just see what data is available and kind of map your implementation of Insight and start to see how the names show up. But the unit is a Insight-specific term. So in other words, for this conversion that's a contact form, there's a unit called unique conversions, and we can start to get a measure of how many of those are unique conversions. Same thing with the touch point. We can see for this touch point, which was named maintenance interest, we can see a total hits or unique hits. And so again, as you add more data dimensions to the table, it's adding additional rows and we're getting more and more granular data. The other thing we could do is we could add a control to this page, and let's add a date range control. And I'll just add that up at the top. And as I pointed out a minute ago, the default date range for this report I think was 28 days, and we could change that to say last month, for example, and hit apply. And then what that'll allow us to do is give your users the option to interact with the report and change the report dates on the fly and see this data change. So to see that in action, let's go ahead and click on View. And now we can see this more in a view mode. And if we watch, we've got 92 rows, and we can change this to some other start date, for example. And we should see that that data changes based on the new start date and end date. So you can start to see how the reports can be interactive and pretty easy to build. You get default sorting for all these columns as well. And you get a lot of just nice things out of the box with Google Data Studio. So there's one more thing that I want to point out before we move on and look at the report that was provided to us by Progress, the concept of filters. And so if I select this table and I scroll down, there is a section called filter, and currently there is not a filter applied at all. And the concept of a filter is just what it sounds like. You can filter data in a table based on some criteria. So for example, typically if you're going to build some sort of dashboard, you're going to want to break these types apart. You're not going to want to look at everything at once. So for example, you may just want to look at a conversion. So maybe I want some sort of data item on the screen that just looks at conversions. And so the way to do that, to filter out that data, is to use a filter. So I'll create add filter. And here it shows me some filters that I've created in the past, but let me go ahead and create a new filter. And the way that you do this is based on, you give it a name to start with. So let's say that I only want to include where the type is conversion. So I've actually already got a filter that I created previously called type is conversion. You can see that up on the upper right hand. But let's just say we'll call it type equals conversion. And the progress data, Sitefinity Insight is the data source. And we only want to include in this filter the data where the type, which again is this first column, equal to, and then a value that we're going to type conversion. So we're creating a filter, and the name of the filter is type equals conversion, and that's just a friendly name that we're going to see that's going to remind us when we apply that filter, it's only going to show the ones that are conversions. And I better make sure to spell conversion right so that the filter will work. So now it's going to include only where the type is equal to conversion, and I'll save that. And then now that is applied. You can see type equal conversion is what we named it, and that report is applied there. And once we have that filter, we can actually use it repeatedly for other data items as well. So let's say, for example, that we added something else like a scorecard, which is usually just an individual data point. And you'll see that the value that was added is a 92. And in this scorecard, it shows a sum of all of the different values from the data that's bound. But in our case, the table above has the filter applied, and so it has a total of 55, whereas our scorecard has a value of 92 because it's summing up all the data, even the rows that are hidden above. So if we apply that same filter to this scorecard where type equals conversion, we'll see that the value there matches 55, which is the sum of all of the values from this data set. In the same way, if we were to go back to the table above and remove this filter by clicking the X, we'll see that 92, which is the same value that we saw whenever we did not have the filter applied to the scorecard. And so you can start to see how the data comes over from Insight, and you can use various charts to bind data. And with some experimentation, you'll be able to build some interactive dashboards. So with that background in terms of the type, the child, the name, the date, and so on, and also the idea of filters, you should start to be able to kind of deconstruct the sample report that Progress has provided. So let's jump back over and look at that. So you can see the report is in edit mode, and I can click on any individual chart item, like for example this one, and once it's selected, I can see that they use the same scorecard that we used previously. I can see the data source is the Progress Sitefinity Insight data source, and I can see that the metric is the sum of all the touch point hits, and that's what makes sense because that's what the label says. But how did they do that? What is that filter? So if I go down here and click on the pencil, you can see that that only includes where the unit is equal to total hits. And so to understand that, I could go back to my cheat sheet and remind myself that there's a unit called total hits for touch point. And so what this is doing is it's summing up all of those total hits from touch points. Same thing with conversions. I can click on conversions and I can look that they've applied a filter called total conversions, and I can click the pencil to see that that is where the type equals conversion. So again, from the cheat sheet, we're only worried about the type where it's equal to conversion. And so you can kind of start to see how these pieces fit together. And then a neat thing that they've added is this little arrow indicator here that shows that it's down 81% from the previous 14 days. And so when you click on this, you can see that the last 14 days is the date, and you can choose to compare this to a previous period, or you could say compare it to no period. But if you choose compare it to the previous period, then it'll automatically show that value. And that's cool because then as you go into view mode And as you change this from, say, 14 days to, say, 30 days and hit apply, then you'll see the data change and you'll also see the label change. So over the last 30 days, my touch point hits are up, my conversions are up, and personas are up, and so on. So let's go back to edit mode and let's look at one that we haven't seen before. This is a pie chart. It's got the name as the dimension, so again the label. It's got the sum as the metric, so it's showing the sum of the value, the number of recognized visitors by persona in that corporate marketer Sitefinity persona. And then it's got a filter as well that I can click on to see. And this one actually has two criteria. We haven't seen one with two before. So this one was where the type equals persona and the unit equals visitors recognized. So we see that from our cheat sheet over here. Type is persona and visitors recognized. And so when we apply that filter, then you just have those in the corporate marketer persona. And then lastly, we've got a line chart, which has a date as the dimension across the bottom. And then it's got a name, which serves as the legend. And then the metric is the value of those various things over time. So just with these basic ideas of adding charts to the design surface, binding them to different dimensions that come from Insight, and then using filters to get at the data that you need, you can start to sort of build your own dashboard and combine and group things in ways that are relevant for your own business. And the real power then comes when you start combining data from various data sources. So for example, if I wanted to, instead of this information down here with these conversions, maybe I wanted to add some data from some other system, I could add like a connector to Google Analytics, for example. And I could choose something from SmoothFusion, from our smoothfusion.com site, and from smoothfusion.com. And then I could start to pull in data from Google Analytics onto the same report that shows Sitefinity Insight data. So now I've got this extra data source on the bound to the report, and to make use of it, maybe I'll add a scorecard down here. And then up at the top now you can see the data source is not Progress Insight, it is the smoothfusion.com data from Google Analytics. So if I wanted, I could change the binding on this chart element, but I'm going to leave it as Google Analytics. And then, so over this period of time, I've had that many new users. And you can see with Google Analytics, they break down the fields very granularly, so all the things you're used to seeing and reporting. So it defaulted here to new users as 297. I could add any other data point that I wanted in the same way that we've seen so far. And when I go and view this report and I change it, then all of the data changes. So if I change from the last 30 days to this year, for example, and hit apply, then we should see new users is going to jump up, as well as the data from Sitefinity Insight at the top. So you can start to see again the power of combining data from various data sources to build dashboards to meet your own needs. I hope this introductory video has been helpful and gives you a sense for how you can start to visualize data from Sitefinity Insight. Thanks for watching.